What is philosophy? That question is our point of contemplation for this evening, and we'll take it up in three parts. In the first part, we'll answer it in the most basic and fundamental sense of the word as philosophy as love of wisdom. Then, in the second part, I endeavor us to reflect on it more deeply through two other questions. One, what is wisdom? And two, what is love? And lastly, in the third part, we'll take a look at yet another quite basic and fundamental definition of philosophy as way of life. Now, this question sounds quite serious, honestly, if I think about it. It's a very simple question, but perhaps for someone, especially who's been trying to study it for quite some time or who has recently developed, say, an appreciation for philosophy, take a look at, say, Ask Philosophy Reddit or Philosophy Reddit pages, that there's quite some weight and vagueness to this question. What is philosophy? And when I started taking philosophy a little more seriously or a little more in depth in my undergraduate studies, if I were to be given this question, what is philosophy? I would have felt immediately a sense of overwhelm at how many different ways and possibilities there are in trying to understand and answer this question. That there's so much to philosophy and there's so many things and concepts that need to be studied first before one can truly understand what philosophy is. So even when I did finish my undergraduate, I think that whole idea of the question, what is philosophy, still remained quite vague for me. And it wasn't until this year when I was able to have an opportunity to really embrace this field of study and allow it to take over my life and the things that I do as more than just being a field of study, which is, I guess, what happens when you try to take it into further studies, that it slowly takes over the rest of your existence somehow in a good way. But eventually I realized that my answer to this question has changed significantly. There are a couple of points or maybe material that I can refer to as being catalyst to that change. But when the other day an old student of mine asked me that very question, what is philosophy? I found myself not met with an overwhelm at how I can deliver all of the things that I've learned so far about philosophy and all of the things that I've researched so that I can answer this question in the best way possible. Rather, I was met by myself with a sense of relief and contentment at what I understand as philosophy now, which is essentially just that that philosophy is love of wisdom. From the word itself, philo as love, Sophia as wisdom. It seems simplistic and perhaps a little too straightforward to say that philosophy is just love of wisdom. But as in all things simple and hopefully profound, in that one short and simple sense, a lot of truth and consequently a lot of wisdom comes in. I guess that definition, being simple as it were, would also require a lot of reflection in order to make more sense. And certainly that was the case. That getting to that answer of philosophy as a love of wisdom has come from a reflection that somehow just needed to go back to the word itself. That after the many attempts at trying to read materials, texts, listen to lectures about what philosophy is, and all the different ways that philosophy can be done, all the different branches of philosophy, eventually one might get back to that very word itself, the very concept itself, as it's really nothing more than just love of wisdom. And I like how the way of saying it as it's really nothing more than this kind of feels like it's devaluing it or something. But I would offer that it's not the case. More so, in trying to put it back into its more simplest sense, that maybe we might be able to find a new kind of appreciation for it. Or at least, certainly, in my experience, I've found that kind of appreciation, which has been really just love in its developments. It kind of parallels how this one other branch of philosophy, phenomenology, would always say to go back to the things themselves, which I find funny in that in a lot of conversations, that very idea of phenomenology, to go back to the things themselves, is always met with a lot of complexity, a lot of going back to so many other things than just the things themselves, which is part of the practice and the field and part of being human, trying to think of things perhaps. But also, that very idea may help us illuminate how we've come to understand philosophy and consequently life in ourselves as well. That at times we may just need to go back to that thing that we're trying to understand in itself. And as we do so, we may get into various tangents and many different perspectives that may sometimes contradict one another and confuse us. And then eventually we go back again to the point that we started with and see that somehow things make a lot more sense, or that where we started from the beginning actually made more sense than we previously thought. And one way, again, of how that tangent happens is by the contradictions that may come about as we try to understand something. That because there are various ways of defining a particular thing, various frameworks to look into, different lenses for seeing things, that inevitably there would be contradicting ideas, or ideas even that seem to be similar but may not be. This can also help us in our understanding of a particular thing. And so, to understand better this idea that philosophy is the love of wisdom, I propose a way of a contrast. That this other way of how philosophy is typically defined is not truly the case that philosophy is, but can help us understand what philosophy is. So, one other way that one might define philosophy may be through the term that it's a desire for knowledge. And if we take a look at it, love of wisdom and desire for knowledge seems to parallel one another. That love is quite synonymous to desire, and that wisdom is not that much different from knowledge. At least they so seem. But I would argue that these two definitions are actually quite contradictory, and that one is what philosophy ought to be, and then the other is something that may be easier for us to see and understand, and so can help us understand what philosophy is. So, desire for knowledge. One way that this can manifest is how we've typically taken up this question again of what philosophy is in this very serious and um, rigorous manner of sorts. And that applies not just to that question of what philosophy is, but to questions that philosophy takes up. That, especially now, there have been a lot more um, various iterations of philosophical questions. And the severity of each questions kind of vary and intensify even more as we begin to look into how values and philosophical ideas affect how we live our lives and interact with others. That we see particular philosophies or ideologies affect and produce great consequences in ourselves, in the world around us, um, in other people, the way we think, the way we grow as individuals and in society. And so, desire for knowledge. Desire comes in with the idea of a particular inclination, or more so a compulsion towards something, compulsion towards knowledge in that sense. That a desire for knowledge may look like an asking of a particular question and wanting a specific, certain answer. And if we try to push that idea even more, not just a particular and certain answer, but a particular and certain answer immediately with much urgency, because perhaps it's important, because perhaps it's significant, because perhaps it's a life or death matter at the moment. And so when we think of this idea of a desire for knowledge, it actually doesn't sound so bad. And at times, one can understand the significance of why this is important in the first place. But I think what could be dangerous, or what needs caution here, is when we try to equate philosophy in its essence as simply a desire for knowledge. That one philosophizes, or one tries to learn because of a particular desire to know more, to have the answers to things, to understand things deeper. Because as we would eventually come to realize, the more we do philosophy, the more that we probably end up to just about knowing nothing much. Or getting to that point where all we can say is, to quote, I know nothing. So let's try to understand what love of wisdom is and how we might be able to contrast that with desire for knowledge. By first asking, one, what is wisdom? Wisdom and knowledge. One can see this in sort of a three-level framework. We begin with this idea of information, which is quite easy for us to understand in this information age. There's data, and then data that has a particular piece of something to be known, something to input in our cognitive minds, is information. And maybe we can say that if that information holds particular truth, if that information is correct, and it has a significance to something else, um, let's say it can help us understand something else, or it can be used, the information can be used to do another task or to move to another kind of information, then it becomes knowledge. But what's wisdom? Wisdom is a little more than that, so it seems. I think even if we're not talking in the realm of philosophy and simply talking in terms of words by how they're used, wisdom is a lot more than just being able to have the correct information that is significant or useful, or having a certain kind of data that can bring about value or utility. That wisdom may be simply put as another kind of rightness to be applied to knowledge, that it's not just knowing the correct information with value, but it's knowing why that information has value, or when that information has value. I guess we can think of wisdom as putting that knowledge into the right context. And so it would denote knowing not just information, but context themselves. And context can be looked at as merely the situation or the space and the time and the conditions that are at the moment, or where the information is situated at. But it also may necessitate knowing the different individuals and the different beings or the different other ideologies or concepts that are involved in the particular context. Now, there's a lot of other ways that we can go about trying to understand what wisdom is. But I really would like to uh, reflect more instead on the other part of what philosophy is. That philosophy is love. But to jump from that, let's take a look at that one particular difference between knowledge and wisdom so far in our definition. That wisdom necessitates an understanding of context. Context being more than just space and time and location, but also the different relations and beings, persons, ideas that are within that situation in which the information is needed. And I think how that understanding comes into play, how it becomes wisdom in itself, is found in what love is. That wisdom, we can say, at its basic form, is knowing what's right, knowing how to take the correct knowledge into a right form of action or understanding. So going from correctness to rightness. But rightness, though complex in itself and quite fruitful in itself, may not be sufficient. A lot of times, if we think of the context between or our understanding of right and wrong, there is always still another standard that we base upon in order to determine the rightness or wrongness of a particular thing. Whether that's in the case, for example, how an idea can be right and also wrong depending on its context, or a particular action can be right or wrong depending on one's understanding of ethics or one's own belief systems. And so, this idea of wisdom is largely connected to then how we understand what love is. That maybe in the phrase "what love of wisdom," we can say that uh, this wisdom then is attributed or can be understood in the context of what love is. That our understanding of rightness in terms of wisdom or appropriateness of a certain knowledge in terms of wisdom is appropriate in the context of love. So, what is love? I think I wanted to focus on this more because it's the one of the most recent readings that I looked into in depth, and surprisingly felt impactful to me. I'm not sure if that's because I spent the time reading it and really trying to understand it, or simply because, as it were, it was eye opening in a sense. Love in philosophy has always been quite a contentious idea or subject for me, as in the earlier years of my study, I've always disliked it when philosophical contexts are tried to explain in terms of love. I feel like it's either uninteresting or not cognitively challenging enough because it's just love. It's just talking about very basic relationship between people or something like that. But as I was reading this text of Jean-Luc Marion's God Without Being, chapter 4, he talks about his definition of God as love and how God is a reversal of vanities as agape, as love. That I've began to have a clearer understanding of how philosophy in itself is a love of wisdom. The book by Jean-Luc Marion is a metaphysical treatise, but as I was reading it, his ideas of what love is was clear. Essentially, I would describe it as this sort of framework that love is a suspension, a kind of suspension, but not really a suspension. A kind of a suspension or stepping back from inclinations between a more human inclination of idolatry and something more idealistic in the more iconoclast desire of humans. The book is essentially a way of Marion trying to conceptualize what God is and how it's difficult for us humans to understand God because God doesn't operate in the same way that we do. That essentially God is outside of how we might perceive ourselves and the world around us, and really what we are in its essence, that we are beings stuck in this being or quite limited in this being. But God is beyond being. God is without being. He is indifferent to the he's indifferent to the things that may bother us as humans, to the things that of life and death, because he's beyond life and death. And so in chapter 4, in Reversal of Vanity, he explains there that we can understand or try to have a glimpse of what God is, of what it means to go beyond our limitations as human beings, and experience a miracle of experiencing the divinity by taking a step back and being in the state of suspension in which we're neither stuck in our limitations of ourselves as beings, but at the same time we're also not in this gaze of trying or having this desire to understand or to see God. This essentially this difference between looking at God as an idol as an icon. That for a moment, if we can take a step back from that, then we might be able to see or experience, albeit momentarily, what it means to be love or what love means. And in that chapter as well, he gives a couple of examples of how that might be understood. And in terms of the different experiences that humans might have already. For example, a lover experiencing love with their beloved being with them, and how that shapes their way of understanding of their experiences. That somehow, when one is deeply in love, they kind of, in a way, transcend the limitations of their being human without stopping being human. They're still truly human, but they seem to be on a different surface, a different stage of existence in which what may negatively affect a person's being doesn't affect them at all because they're in love. And how that may also be understood in, say, this lack of one's beloved. That when one's beloved is not there, then it's a kind of sadness, a kind of despair that's not really grounded on what is there in the material or tangible reality of the person, but it's something beyond. And that beyond is where love is sourced upon, where love is rooted in, where love comes from. That love, in its truest, greatest sense, is not something that is rooted into what we value, what we see as useful, or what we understand as significance, but in itself is a kind of meaning that is meaning on its own. And I think that's how philosophy has been for me. That it's more than just wanting to understand particular events where life or myself or existence. It's also more than just wanting to know a lot of things. Of course, all of those things, all of those desires that come when one tries to be more enlightened with their experiences are still there. But at the end of the day, we might get into a point where there's really no solving or no getting rid of those desires. No amount of knowledge, no amount of knowing, no such certainty can truly get rid or address or fulfill that desire and a desire for knowledge. So when we take upon something as as meaningless, as as simple, as what others may say useless as philosophy, and take it as a path towards certainty, path towards fulfilling particular desires on knowing, then might feel like getting hit by a brick wall at the end of an attempt. However, it's not to say that it's not a good thing to try to get into philosophy or try to approach these things that we do with a desire for knowledge. Because as we can see in another way of defining philosophy as a way of life, at times that's just how love kind of forms. That we get into a particular situation because it's attractive for us, because it has use for us, because it looks valuable or significant. And so we put in our efforts there. We put in our energies, our attempts into that thing. We spend time with that thing. We get to know it more. We try to fulfill that desire. And by miracle, perhaps, as we do that, as we try to fulfill that desire, you might get to know that point of desire a little more. And eventually, this thing called love comes in. And so that desire can possibly develop into something that's a little more sustainable, a little more long lasting, and a lot more useless love. But love as a way of life, that looking at philosophy as a way of life, we mean that eventually we have to let go of that compulsion to want to get the answers for our particular questions, to let go of trying to develop certainties, or let go of trying to get rid of uncertainties. But philosophy as a way of life may simply mean persisting in that love, in philosophizing with the complete awareness that the uncertainties aren't there to be dissolved, but are there to be embraced. And eventually we might get into this kind of philosophizing in which we take questions such as, what is philosophy? What does it mean to know? What is life? What is love? What is wisdom? All of those questions. And find the courage to keep on asking them, keep on thinking about them, dwelling in them, without feeling the pressure of wanting to get something out of that questioning, without that compulsion towards answers. And simply enjoy that process of asking, or thinking about the answer, or reflecting on that answer, dwelling in that situation, context, those fragmented pieces of information that may or may not be knowledge, may or may not be significant, but somehow calls out for us. How can we go about this then? I think that's the easier way of going about things, of trying to understand all of these ideas is okay, philosophy is love of wisdom, philosophy is a way of life, but really, what does it mean? You can keep on going about how we should stay in that answer and reflect on it, but still, what does it mean? What are we to do now? And I think what I'd propose as one idea for that is to take things a little slow, or to one way of life, meaning have it as part of our lives, of one's life, and two, what are we to have as part of our lives? Perhaps it's the contemplative manifestation of philosophy that even now, as I'm trying to understand this question and trying to present ideas about what philosophy is, there's this compulsion in me to try to perfect what it means and to give the clearest definition for it, and to just keep speaking at every turn and not let myself think, because I am supposed to know what it is, given that I thought of the question for this moment. But I think I'd like to keep all those moments of silence, of stopping, of dwelling into where we're at a particular moment, of taking one's time and connecting the different thoughts, or allowing the different thoughts to not connect with one another, and see that as a worthwhile endeavor that I think is, though can I though that can be difficult to apply, more so nowadays when things seem to be going by so fast that now it's already evening and there's still so much to be done, and still so many questions that can be answered, still so many ideas that can be discussed. It seems that in this situation, the easiest thing is to just get all of these done. And the hardest is to just dwell on one thing and then another, or even do nothing for a moment before going on to another. And dwelling not because of giving up out of boredom or lack of interest or melancholy about how things are, but not doing anything and just being, that is being with love. I tried to explain a little about how Jean-Luc Marion and I understand what love is, but I think at the end of it, love and wisdom as well. And so, consequently, the very definition of philosophy as love of wisdom, and also philosophy as way of life, will simply end up putting us back to where we started then. Us, the questioners of the question, us who are trying to figure out the answer to this, that really at the end of it, we're the only ones who can tell us what we mean by love, what we mean by wisdom. Surely other materials, other philosophers can try to explain their own ways of understanding it. But love, as how Marion understands God, is not really something to be comprehended, not something to be read about, and maybe not even something to be experienced. But it's a sort of miraculous happenstance in a way that as we perhaps live a life of openness towards wisdom, towards philosophy, towards love, or towards God, then in the intermittent times that we are met by this, that we get to experience it authentically and in full, we may develop a relationship towards it, an understanding that's not merely cognitive or not merely emotional, but something beyond all of that. So, that is what our contemplations on philosophy has been so far for this evening. And to quote Wittgenstein, at the end, it's silence. Um, I can't say anything anymore, so I shall be in silence.